Welcome to all. It's wonderful to see the names, if not all the faces as yet. So I'd be happy if everyone were to put themselves on video so that we can actually see who's joined us. But if you don't feel like that, that's also okay. So for those who don't know me, my name's Cedric Geffen. I'm the president of MOTL Australia, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening on this very auspicious evening, the day after International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So the question then is, so who is Jonny Daniels and why have I asked him to talk with us tonight? Exactly one day after the commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And exactly on the day that the news of a neo-Nazi white supremacist group's activity in Hall's Gap here in Victoria makes headlines. Well, all of this will be revealed over the next 40 minutes or so. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Jonny, a good friend, a comrade in arms in the fight to create a better world, a fellow Israeli living in a distant land who embodies the saying of the internationally renowned public speaker, Mark Sanborn, anyone, anywhere can make a difference. Thank you, Jonny.
Thank you very, very much. Cedric, it's always lovely to speak to you and nice to come to all of you there as well. The question, who is Jonny Daniels? I won't be able to answer that quite yet, and we'll leave it for everybody to figure it out and work out themselves as the presentation goes along. But the main answer and the main point of what we're doing today is dealing with the issue of Holocaust memory memorial and Holocaust education, and looking and trying to figure out how we deal with it from a perspective of millennials. And this is kind of, I'll be sharing with you my journey into this field and explaining how we have worked off my experience to hopefully influence and impact others. So I'm going to share my screen with you now and talk you through a little bit of a presentation about my foundation and everything that we do. Okay. So we started with the organization from the depths, and I created this foundation in 2014. I was born and raised in the United Kingdom, in London, England, as you can probably hear from my lovely accent. And at the age of 18, I made Aliyah. I moved to Israel. I served in the army, and following my army service, I started to get involved in politics in Israel. I became an advisor to the Deputy Speaker of the Knesset, the Ministry of Defense, and worked partially on the Prime Minister's campaign with Prime Minister Netanyahu and with others. And in 2013, Prime Minister Netanyahu stood up and gave a big speech about Ahmadinejad, the leader of Iran at the time. And he spoke about the fact that the Iranians were threatening to wipe the Jews off the map. And people got very upset. People got very upset with the Holocaust comparison. People got very upset with the fact that he'd mentioned such a thing in such a way. And it really struck a chord with me. It struck a chord because, like a lot of you watching this, and like a lot of people I know in Australia and around the world, my grandfather, by the way, was actually born in Australia. But the other part of my family were from Poland. They were almost all entirely wiped out. Everybody besides my great-grandfather were all murdered. After 7 years in Poland, we still don't know where. They came from a very small city, village, I suppose you could say, in the north of Poland. And I never wanted to visit Poland. Growing up in London, I'd had the opportunity to visit with school and with other places many times. And I was scared. I was scared to go, and I was scared to experience. And I didn't know how I'd feel. I'd been many times. I'd read many books about the Holocaust, but I'd never visited. And in 2013, sparked by my work in the Knesset, I took my first trip to Auschwitz. And as I walked in Auschwitz, it really struck a very strong chord within me. I know that most of you would have been on March of the Living, I presume, and have been to these places and seen these tremendously difficult sites. And when I was there, it impacted me in a way that I realized we need to do more. And so what we did was we stepped up as a foundation with the contacts and the relationships that I had in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament at the time. We decided on International Holocaust Memorial Day, which is the 27th of January, yesterday, to bring a delegation together. And what we did, and what I was able to do, was convince the Polish government to invite the Israeli government, and the Israeli government to accept the Polish government, all without really wanting to invite each other, but somehow managed to make it happen. And for the first time in history, the majority of the Israeli government, the Knesset, the parliament, left the state of Israel on 2 airplanes, as for not everyone to travel on 1. Each member of Knesset was accompanied by a survivor of the Holocaust. And like March of the Living, but at a different time, we all went one day to Auschwitz. And that experience was formidable and impactful on another level. Again, there's no better group to speak to than March of the Living in terms of understanding the impact of visiting a site like this. It's preaching to the choir. And with doing this event, it kind of threw me into the headlines, I suppose you could say. I was 27 years old at the time. I'm 35 today. And it really, the media took a big interest in who's this young person, why is he interested, and why is he involved, both in Israel, but also in Poland as well. And then I kind of finished this event with the foundation, and I thought I'd go back to my regular life, maybe be a little bit involved at the side. But what happened was incredibly interesting. Journalists on the ground in Poland started to reach out to me. They'd interviewed me about why we were doing this. They were very happy to see a young person involved, and they started to tell me stories. They started to tell me stories of Jewish heritage and history that was all but lost, and just literally waiting to be found. So one of the first calls we got was about the Wisła River. The river, the Wisła River is, as you know, cuts through Poland, it cuts through Warsaw, takes from Praga, the south of Warsaw, to the city center. And they told me that in the river were tombstones, matzevot. And I said, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And slowly, I started to go there myself. As you can see in this picture, literally uncover fragments of Jewish tombstones. During and after the Holocaust, there was almost an entire destruction of Jewish cemeteries in Poland. Pre-war Poland, there were about 1,300 Jewish cemeteries. There's more Jewish cemeteries in Poland than there are even in the state of Israel. People lived in small cities and shtetls over a sort of expanse area with the inability to travel far. So what would often happen would they'd build a small cemetery next to their village. And in a place like Warsaw, many of you would have been, and you have visited Okopowa, the big Jewish cemetery in Okopowa, which is in good condition and looks very nice. However, Okopowa, however big and sort of massive it seems, was the smaller Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. The bigger Jewish cemetery was across the river in Praga, in the Praga district of Warsaw, where in the cemetery there are an estimated 400,000 tombstones. Today, there remains about 3, meaning 397,000 Jewish tombstones were taken from the cemetery and used for all different purposes. They were used to rebuild the city of Warsaw. They were used to buffer up the riverbed in the Wisła, which is what we found there. They were used to build public parks and all other things. So we started this action of returning these tombstones. And what we did was we again utilized this sort of understanding of social media and PR to do stuff in a slightly different way. Yeah, so these pictures that you can see right now, this picture here is, these are the tombstones that we found in the Wisła River, the matzevot. You can see here clearly the bottom part of a Jewish tombstone. And then again, the question was, how do we, with so much of this around, how do we grab the public's attention? How do we also do it in a way that isn't threatening, right? Because if we're to come and point fingers and get angry and go mad, everyone kind of, especially in a place like Poland, people really become very insular and don't want to share. So what we did was we thought of unique ways and different actions to do with things. So in this slide over here, you can see these lovely looking gentlemen These are Poland's strongmen. These two guys over here are the strongest men in Poland. They all different international competitions. And what happened is that we received a phone call from a gentleman, and on the left-hand side, you can see them holding a rope. They're holding up a tombstone, which is in the shape of a tree, which was a tombstone that was stolen from the Jewish cemetery and used in somebody's garden. The local family found this, were incredibly sort of upset with this, wanted to return it. It was too heavy for me to lift, and I had no idea what to do. So we reached out to the Strongman Association and managed to get them to come along and volunteer with us. As you can imagine, it got huge media interest in Poland on ground. People saw this. People saw, not the kind of guys you'd expect to be walking around a Jewish cemetery, walking around and getting involved and getting active. And it prompted a huge outreach across the country, not just in terms of dealing with matzevot, with Jewish tombstones, but dealing with other artifacts and other parts of heritage and history as well. One of the things that we soon discovered, we received a phone call from a shepherd in northern Poland. The shepherd called me to his home and he lifted the sofa. And what he showed me, you can see there on the table. Now, I'm sure many of you will recognize what it is. It's the half of a Torah scroll. He was a very young boy at the outbreak of the war. He lived in a town called Filipov in northern Poland. And he remembers the day, and he was telling me in this picture that he remembered the day that the Germans rounded up the Jews in the city. He remembers it clearly because he was a young boy. And the Germans were rounding up the Jews, and he said it was a petrifying experience. The screams and the cries and the loud shouts, and they were in their home. And they were standing, they was in the home, and he was looking out the window. The father was shouting at him not to look, and he remembers the fear. And suddenly there was a knock on the door. There was a knock on the door, and the father went to open. He went with his father, and standing there was the rabbi. The rabbi was crying and sweating and sad, and he had something in his arms. He pushed it to the father, and he says, "Look after this. Please watch this and take care of this until either I return or another Jew comes and knows what to do with it." He took this item and put it under the sofa. And it remained there for 75 years until we went back and until he called us and we came to collect it. Unfortunately, the family ended up using part of the Torah scroll for handbags and so on and so forth. They didn't necessarily understand the significance, but we were able to rescue at least that part. And what we did with that was, I very much felt like the Torah needed to be restored and used once again. So we set out on a mission where we went around in Israel, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in other places. Haven't yet been to Australia, where we've been filling the missing part of the Torah, and the letters are being written only by survivors of the Holocaust. This Torah, which in itself survived, is a survivor. It's the last remnants of that city. We later found out that the Jews of Filipov were murdered the next day in Treblinka. No one survived. This Torah is the last memory of them. So we set out on this mission to fill and to make sure that we complete this Torah. And as I said, everybody who's writing letters are Holocaust survivors, and we're doing it in their memory. The endlessness of phone calls and of artifacts and of things we're receiving is really quite remarkable. On the left-hand side of the picture, you can see me standing by over a dozen other Torah scrolls. These are in the basement of a church in the middle of Poland. The priest stole them during the war. They're now in the basement. The Jewish community and others have been trying to get them back. It's a very difficult and lengthy process, but they allowed me in there to see them, and it was shocking and horrifying just to see these holy scrolls laying there. And on the right-hand side, you can see me standing with a drum. This was a drum that we were also called about. That was, as you can see, sadly built using the skin of a Torah scroll. And these are things that are being discovered and are uncovered until today. It's a sort of never-ending mission in terms of what we're able to find. And through this process and receiving these phone calls and dealing with these tombstones and the Torah scrolls and these other artifacts and this interest of people and more media and getting the stories out, people would come to me with more information. And one day I received a phone call from Warsaw Zoo asking me to come. I didn't quite know what they wanted from me in the zoo, but I went regardless. And what you can actually see here in this picture is a pile of what looks like rubble. The zoo decided to renovate a part of the main road that cuts through the zoo in the center of Warsaw. And what they discovered was the entire zoo, almost the entire zoo, was paved using Jewish tombstones. The same Jewish tombstones that were broken and stolen from the Jewish cemetery in Brudno, in Prague, in Warsaw, were cut up and used to rebuild Warsaw Zoo. A lot of the time, the tombstones would actually be, even though they were cut up, the letters would be put face down. Presumably the builders even felt a bit guilty about it. But within that, quite amazingly, often they were preserved. So in a lot of cases like this, we'll attempt to piece them back together. It's very, very difficult. We just basically return them to the Jewish cemetery. Obviously, we don't know where often the person was buried and unable to place the tombstone on exactly that site. But regardless, bringing them back is something that's very important to do. And what the zoo also then brought out was another completely different part of this history. So in the zoo, we were told of the Żabinski family. Many of you would have seen the movie The Zookeeper's Wife or have heard about it. The Zookeeper's Wife is a true story based on Jan and Antonina Żabinski. Jan and Antonina Żabinski were the zookeeper and his wife who managed to stay on in the Warsaw Zoo, and they turned the zoo into a hiding place, into a refuge for Jewish people. And I went there and I visited the zoo and I heard this story, and the villa still exists. I don't know, Cedric, if you'd visited as March of the Living, Warsaw Zoo?
Yes, we have.
Wonderful. So you would have gone down into the basement, you would have seen all the Hebrew on the wall and all the different documents. We partnered with the zoo that's from the depths, translated all of that, found a lot of the information. And they told me that there weren't any survivors living. So we set out and did some research, and this incredible man that you can see here in this picture, his name's Moshe Tirosh. Moshe Tirosh lives in Carmiel in Israel, and he is, as far as we know, the last living survivor of Warsaw Zoo. He was brought there as a young man. The father was able to somehow smuggle them out the Warsaw Ghetto. Incredible story, really worth a movie in itself. Moshe's father was a very famous pre-war Jewish boxer, and they had to escape the ghetto because he actually killed quite a lot of the Jewish police inside of the ghetto. One day, Moshe and his mother were put on a transport to be taken out to fill a quota. He was in hiding the entire time, the father, because he was a big fella and the Nazis would have seen him, they would have killed him immediately, and he was well known. They called for him, he came down and he said, look, let my wife and kid go. The Judenrat refused, and he didn't have a choice and took matters quite literally into his own hands, saving his wife and son and everybody else in that transport. And literally a day or two later, they realized they had to get out. And with the help of a Polish person they knew beforehand, they put them in a cart full of garbage, a horse and cart. And the problem was getting across the river from the side of the Warsaw Ghetto to Praga, to where the Warsaw Zoo is. And they smothered the Polish driver of the horse and cart in vodka. He stank. And they said, when you go across the bridge, zigzag a little bit. They'll just think you're drunk. So he starts zigzagging along. The police go to stop him. The stench of the garbage and of the vodka, they're like, just go. He went across. Little did they know that they were hiding inside. They were hidden inside of the zoo for a period of time, taken to other places, and this is how he survived the war. And so then after that, we started to get a little bit more involved. We worked on the movie The Zookeeper's Wife. Here, many of you will recognize our friend, Shira Haas. Shira, many of you will recognize her from that recent Netflix show, Unorthodox. But she was also in The Zookeeper's Wife. And Shira actually is someone that we work with at the foundation. She came to Poland with us, and this is her standing in front of the Żabinski Villa the day of the premiere of The Zookeeper's Wife in Warsaw. And so we start this process from the tombstones to the artifacts to Warsaw Zoo to start looking with survivors and working with them. And it led us to other places as well. And one of the places it led us to was this home. This home and this picture was taken in a very small town near Radom, so about an hour and a half south of Warsaw. A very small city, village, I suppose, is called Rakówka, next to Chirpelov, Radom. And we were told that there's a family, the Skochilas family, and we have to go there. So we enter this property, and as you can see from a little bit, this is the entrance to their kitchen. So it's quite a big rural property. And we enter the property, and this gentleman and his wife saw me and burst out crying, which people have many different reactions to me. Crying tends to not be one of them. I was a little shocked, and I didn't quite understand what was going on. And they told me, "You're the first Jewish person to be here in over 75 years." And I still didn't really understand what was going on. So this gentleman took me. He lifted the lino flooring, which you can see, started lifting up some boards, and showed me underneath the crawling space, this tiny hiding space where 4 Jews were hiding for a period during the war. Sadly, the family were ratted out by the daughter of the local mayor, as it happens. The Germans came. The Jews, miraculously, for whatever reason, were not in the hiding place, but the Germans found this place, looked inside, and found a small book in Hebrew. We presume it's a prayer book. We don't know. It's not there anymore. And the entire Polish family were rounded up, were taken to the barn, besides one young boy, and they were murdered. The Germans set the barn alight, murdering them. The young son, who wasn't at the home, was this gentleman's father-in-law. And he returned and carried on living at their house. And this house remains in this state until today. From all the hiding places and other such things, this is the only one that we know, which is in the exact condition it was and in existence. And once again, this was a humongous media story. This was in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all around the world. This was being spoken about, and obviously very much in Poland as well. So when this happens, once again, people started reaching out. We started working with the righteous and supporting them and doing what we could to help them. And over the last 5 years, we've taken a lot of our focus as a foundation into what we can do for these people, because exactly the same as the artifacts, as these Torahs, as these matzevahs, they're kind of forgotten. Obviously, these heroes are given the recognition by the state of Israel. Yad Vashem gives them the honor of righteous amongst the living, gives them the opportunity also to make aliyah if they want to. When they receive the title of righteous amongst the nations, they also receive honorary citizenship to the state of Israel, which allows them to move to Israel. Out of the 22,000 odd righteous, roughly 100 ended up moving to Israel. The rest stayed where they were. And in this picture, you can see this is a little bit of the work that we've done with them in supporting them. In the bottom right picture, I'm dancing with Mrs. Alicia Schnepp. We held an evening called Dancing with the Righteous, where we had music and lots of young people, obviously pre-COVID, and really just trying to focus in terms of helping and supporting them however we can. And this is something that's run through until now, and this is actually why I'm in Poland at the moment, not in Israel with my children. At the beginning of COVID, I came back to Poland, knowing I'd be stuck here, not realizing for this long, but with the idea and purpose of supporting them. We've been delivering food and support and masks and sanitizers and everything that we can to support them through this process, both the righteous in Poland and in other places as well. And it was always a question of what we can do to support. Because as is often with people in this age bracket, especially in former in Eastern Europe and in other such countries, if you give them money, it just goes in the bank. They're not going to use it on what they really need, which is why we take them food and what they actually can use, as opposed to just sending money. And one of the programs that we started, this is more, events that we've done with the righteous, celebrating them and honoring them with members of parliament from the state of Israel, members of parliament from the United States, from Poland, obviously, from the United Kingdom. We held until COVID an event every few months where they'd come, we'd honor them, we'd do some, big gestures for them, just be there to be of support for them, and to help however we can. In that picture, actually, you'll see our honorary president and chairman. The honorary president of our foundation is Mr. Edward Mossberg, who many of you will recognize from March of the Living. Edward is a survivor of the Holocaust himself. And Mr. Avram Grant was the former manager of Chelsea Football Club, and Israeli national soccer team, so quite a big figure in that world as well. This was last year, celebrating the 100th birthday of Mr. Yosef Yarosh, Yosef Wowaszczak, I'm sorry, the oldest living righteous. He actually celebrated his 101st birthday about a month ago. We celebrated a little bit smaller this time, still went with a surprising cake and flowers to wish him happy birthday. And then it led us to this project, which we inaugurated about 2.5 years ago. This is a project which, as many of you will recognize and notice, London taxis. Again, I'm from London and go back there often to visit my grandmother and family. And when in London, I was with my kids and we jumped in a black cab and they were incredibly excited. And, it's a very iconic and useful vehicle. So what we did is we started to look about. I managed to find a Jewish chap in London who owned a fleet of taxis. There's all these new regulations in the UK now that they have to decommission the taxis after 13 years. They can't run them anymore because of emissions and so on and so forth. But still good quality vehicles. So I was able to convince him to donate a couple to us. And what we did is we took these taxis. We, through Avram, managed to get Chelsea Football Club involved. Chelsea decided to partner with us and to sponsor this program. The bottom picture is the inauguration of this program in the Houses of Parliament, where you can see the chairman of Chelsea Football Club, Mr. Avram Grant, members of British Parliament and others, where we inaugurated this program. We brought the taxis to Poland, and the taxis are being used daily. And it's just truly the most incredible thing, because we were able to take this important need of theirs, which is obviously mobility. And we were finding that many of them were going even to speak to groups. And I'm sure it's not March of the Living, because March of the Living thinks differently, but many other Israeli groups or American groups would come to Poland, but ask them to speak and not think necessarily to offer to send them a vehicle to pick them up. It would escape their minds. So we'd be finding these incredible heroes in their 90s, often taking multiple trams and buses and walking, and the weather's not as good in Poland as it is in Australia, and they had a real hard time getting about. So we put these taxis in there for them. It's free, 24/7. Whenever they need, whatever they need, they call us, we come up, we pick them and take them. The other great thing about the London taxis is they also have ramps inside, so they come down and it's easy to get on. And once again, we found ourselves in a really wonderful position where we're able to support them every single day, even during COVID. Once again, we bring them things so they don't need to go out, but often they do, if it's to the doctors or visit, a loved one and they in the cemetery, to whatever it may be. And so we're able to take them in the London taxis. They have this partition between the driver and the passenger. And so really, it's something that we're very grateful to do. Last week, the taxis drove, I think, 41 hours, which is, a lot, considering also many of them are not leaving their homes. And we don't just work with righteous in Poland. We work wherever the righteous are, supporting them and helping and doing whatever we can, and also, most importantly, telling their stories. One of the stories that I was shocked to learn about initially was the story of the Albanian righteous. Many of you, I'm sure, will know, Albania was the only place under occupation during the Second World War where there were more Jews after than before the Second World War. And this was due to this mentality of Albanians called Besa, which is this openness. Jews were saved there. And we visited the last two righteous in Albania. I interviewed them both and spoke to them. Many of the interviews you can find on our Facebook page, and you'll be able to see afterwards. And amazingly, when I sat down and asked these people, why did you do it? The response of both of them was the same, and the response of the families of the others was because the Quran tells us to. These are practicing religious Muslims. And it really was quite amazing to see that, you know, in a time really of such diversity and difficulty between nations, these are shining lights and brightness points of examples of just wonderful heroism and exceptionalism. And Albania is really a remarkable place. You know, I presume March of the Living won't be taking any trips to Albania, but if you have time, I definitely recommend going there. It's an amazing place to see and to visit. We also work with celebrities, and this is a huge part of getting the message across to the next generation. Many of you will recognize the gentleman in the red shirt. That's Mike Tyson. Quite a well-known figure internationally, and not someone that you'd necessarily expect to be dealing with the issues of Holocaust Memory Memorial, which is exactly what we want. Again, preaching to the choir and talking to Jews about the Holocaust is important. It must be done. We must be doing academic work. We must be writing books, and all of these things are crucial and important. And all of these things are happening very, very well with organizations, but we still have the statistics that we have. And all of you are aware of the fact that 2/3 of Americans hadn't heard about Auschwitz. Millennials don't know anything about the Holocaust. All of you would have heard this. And the question's why? You know, we're putting so much money into building museums and into making, writing more books and more books and more academic works. And the honest answer is because we're not infiltrating pop culture. We're not making this something, look, it's not a subject that's an easy subject, right? It's not easy to sit there and to talk to a young person or whoever it is about the death of 6 million people, 6 million Jews. It's a very difficult thing. But what we found is that there's a way to do it, at least partially, and it helps part of the problem. The way that we've been doing is, again, working with these celebrities. You know, when Mike Tyson came to the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, which you can see on the left, and David Haye, who's a world champion boxer, also the world heavyweight former champion from the UK, when these two guys were able to bring them out and take them to the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial and talk to them about even Moshe Tirosh, who we spoke about before, this survivor from the Warsaw Zoo, whose father was a boxer, to explain to them, to get them a little bit involved, they both went back, put on their Instagrams, hit an entire group of people that, you know, probably would have never heard about it before. Again, Mike Tyson is obviously, you know, an interesting character and not the person you'd necessarily expect to talk about this stuff. But when he does, people listen. And the kind of kids and people who are following his social media are not the same people that are going to be picking up a Jewish newspaper or going to a bookstore and buying a book about the Holocaust. So we're able to approach and impact different groups. The same here. On the right-hand side, you can see Ray Allen, NBA All-Star. Ray, one of the last appointees of President Obama, Barack Obama, was to put Ray on the board of the US Holocaust Museum, the first African-American on the board. And we reached out to Ray a couple of years ago and I said, hey, like, you know, you're on the board, it's great, but have you been? He's like, no, no one took us. So we figured it out and we brought Ray to Poland and we took him to the German Nazi death camps. We showed him where the Warsaw Ghetto was. We introduced him to the righteous. We even took him to that hiding place that we showed you before. And we gave Ray, within 3 or 4 days, a very immersive experience. In fact, Ray extended his trip by 2 days. He was only meant to be there 2 days, and we ended up staying 4. He wanted to stay longer and learn more. And really, that's been our approach the entire time. And on the left is a picture that some of you may recognize. Again, that's Mr. Edward Mossberg on the top. And speaking to him is an NFL American football player called Deshaun Jackson. Deshaun, quite notably, about 6 months ago, put something quite horrendous on his Instagram. On his Instagram, he shared some made-up quote that Hitler was referring to how Jews wanted to kill all the blacks. It was completely insane. It wasn't true. It was made up. He didn't know that. He shared it on his Instagram, and everybody went crazy. Everybody went crazy, calling for him to be kicked off the American football team that he's a part of. The media had a field day with it. And I was watching this sort of unravel, and I realized there was another way around this. And the other way was, rather than coming and bashing him on the head and canceling him and getting him to lose everything he has and turn him really into someone who doesn't want to partner or doesn't want to learn, was to sit down and talk to him. And what better person than to teach him than Mr. Mossberg, than a Holocaust survivor? And so Eddie got on the phone with him. We had a Zoom call with the 3 of us. And the lack of knowledge, again, you can't always blame him. I got on the phone with him and we started talking initially. I said, look, Deshaun, I said, obviously what you did was wrong. There's no doubting that. And you're sorry for it. I get that. But let's discuss the bigger issue. The bigger issue is you don't know. And I don't blame you for that. It's the same way that I have no idea about Black suffering in the United States. Like, I've seen a few movies about it, but I'm British. I lived in Israel. I spent time in Europe. I don't know about that. I understand that African Americans were brought as slaves. I have no idea how many. I think I know roughly what year it was, but even that I don't know. So the fact that you don't understand my suffering is understandable, because I also don't understand yours. But let's work together and learn from each other. Later this year, depending obviously on COVID restrictions, Deshaun will be joining us with Mr. Mossberg in Poland, where we're going to be visiting the concentration camps. And that picture on the left really was sort of headline news in America for quite a few days. It was breaking story on CNN, New York Times, all the sports channels as well. We took this opportunity of someone's mistake, and once again, rather than attacking him, we were able to educate him. And through him, his following on social media is absolutely massive. So we're able to take that and impact and hopefully sort of push forward to the next generation. We also work with other celebrities, people like Dean Cain, who you can see over here. Dean, well known as Superman from the Lewis and Clark show in the 90s, a very famous TV show. This was in New York with Stephen Baldwin, who you can see in the background there. And Dean's been with us many times to Poland as well. This is in the exact same hiding place that we saw before. And through Dean, also able to educate a completely different group of people. And this brings us on to a pretty incredible graphic that we actually uncovered yesterday. This graphic is from Google Analytics, and it shows the interest in the search of the Holocaust from 2004 until now. Take a look at this. This is the interest in the Holocaust from 2004 until now. There's a decrease every single year in the amount of times that people are Googling Holocaust or Googling anything Holocaust related. It's kind of shocking and very, very disturbing. As sadly survivors are leaving us, people are less interested. Obviously, there's not a correlation between that, but once again, it brings the point to what's gone wrong. What's gone wrong from 2004 and even before then until now, that the general population are not learning about this, are not interested, and are not learning from this. They're not even Googling it. It doesn't come into their mind. So the answer, at least from our perspective, is here. It's in Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. We started a TikTok page actually only 4 days ago. A social media influencer, a friend of mine here in Poland, was pushing me for ages to get involved. You know, many of you may notice TikTok or recognize it from your children or grandchildren, these silly dances and these sort of quick videos that spin around and are usually involved around joking and other things. But what we've been successful in doing over the last few days, really just over the last few days, is sharing content, educating people on the Holocaust. Yesterday, we did a 20-second video where I basically look straight at the camera, I'm walking, it's interesting, it's modern, and I ask people how long they can be quiet for. Could you be quiet for a day, a month, a week? How long could you be quiet for? And then I told them if they were quiet for 1 minute for every single person, every single Jew who lost their life in the Holocaust, they'd have to be quiet for 11 and a half years. It's a shocking statistic. It's something that really, it's quick, it's 23 seconds. You grab people's interest, you get them involved. And so far in the last 4 days, our content has been viewed close to 300,000 times, which is pretty exceptional for a brand new account. But again, it's pushing through these platforms, it's working with celebrities, it's creating an interest that may be slightly different. And I could carry on for a lot longer, telling many, many more stories about the kind of work we do, about the righteous that we're working with, about the artifacts that we're discovering, and about the education that we're doing. And I've missed a lot out simply because of time. But basically, in a nutshell, that's who we are and what we do.
Jonny, that was absolutely fantastic. I've heard those stories before, but believe me, every time you tell them, every inch of the way, every new initiative is food for thought, and something that I'm sure the audience here this evening would possibly like to question you further about or hear more about. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open the floor to any questions from the audience. I'll give it a few seconds of ominous silence if there is such a thing. But if not, if there is, I'll jump in because I've got plenty of questions up my sleeve. And but if not, I really would encourage the audience to take the opportunity and raise any questions, comments, ideas, thoughts, things that you have. So please go ahead. Is there anybody with a question? You can jump in straight away. Is there anybody with a question? I'll ask once, I'll ask twice, and if not, I'm going to jump in with the first question, and that is, going back to where you started, you mentioned the impact of that initial delegation that you were part of organizing, of the majority of the Knesset together with survivors, etc., that was the catalyst that pumped the adrenaline through you so hard that that's what got you started. However, that's easier said than done, or it seems a lot simpler than it actually was. And so my question to you is, how, as a 28-year-old, do you take the decision to go and set up a foundation? Where do you go? What do you do? Who did you turn to? What did you do initially in order to set this up? Because I've witnessed the growth of the extent of your activities almost, I think, from day one, and it's actually quite phenomenal. It's totally exceptional, and so share with us some of how you've made this happen.
If I share all my secrets, anyone could do it, Cedric. It's it's interesting, but I listen to a lot of podcasts, and often you'll hear incredible people talking, and they say, well, how did you come up with that idea in the first place? They said, if I knew how difficult it was, I wouldn't have done it. It was a huge jump at the beginning to set up the foundation. I mean, we had this thought of bringing the majority of the Knesset, which is just crazy. And again, I alluded to it slightly, but it was the first time in history that a sovereign government has held a meeting on the grounds of another sovereign government. It was something that was too much for people to quite understand at the time. And because, thankfully, to be honest with you, because of not brilliant relations between Poland and Israel at the time, and because of really not very good diplomats, I was able to sort of maneuver things behind the scenes without people quite understanding what was happening. So I went to the Speaker of the Knesset, which was Yuli Edelstein at the time, and his staff, the Director General of the Knesset, Ronen Flot, who actually now was the acting director of Yad Vashem. And I told Ronen, I said, look, the Poles want to invite you. And, accept. And he was, what do you mean? And then I said to the Poles that, look, the Israelis want to come, you've got to invite them. And then what we were able to do, and actually, my secret weapon at the time were two people who were sadly no longer with us. The first was Eddie Wiesel, of blessed memory. Eddie was the first person I sat with when I thought about opening my foundation. And I said, Eddie, how dare I? Like, I'm not a survivor. I'm not a historian. I'm not an educator. How can I talk about such a thing? And Eddie said, Jonny, you got it wrong. You have to. He said, you're my witness. If your generation don't stand as witnesses of the witnesses, everything is lost. And I looked around and I looked at all the organizations. I looked at March of the Living. I looked at everybody and I said, partner with me, work with me. Let's do this together. And everyone went, he's a kid. He won't do it. Pointless. Which kind of made me want to do it even more. And it was that pushback against me that really sort of spurred me to do it. Somehow raised $1.5 million to pay for the whole thing, and convinced a lot of good people to get involved. I mean, we had, looking back at it now, it's quite funny, but I mean, I convinced Andrea Bocelli to join us, and we held a dinner at the end with all the Holocaust survivors, members of Knesset, Righteous, and others, and Andrea Bocelli performed for us. And really, it was, with Andrea, for example, it was no more than asking. Wrote a very good letter, followed up very nicely, utilized contacts I had, and we're able to push people. And I found, especially when dealing with this subject, it's as much as asking someone. It's the same way that we're dealing with people like Mike Tyson. Just ask. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I mean, it tends to be that we'll work with local authorities, right? So, for example, one of the first cases we uncovered was the case of a park in the center of Warsaw. A local journalist brought me there, and the entire park was made using Jewish tombstones. These pergolas, stairs, steps where the kids were playing, everything. You just turned the stone over, dug a little bit, turned it over. Hebrew writing. It was absolutely shocking. And I went to the municipality and I got in for a meeting with the mayor. And again, coming from Israeli politics, I understand how that works. And so I went in for a meeting and, oh, this is terrible. Never heard of such a thing. Show us on a map where it is. And so I played the game a little bit and I showed them on a map and, oh, this is awful. We have elections in a year. As soon as elections are done, we'll have more of a budget. We'll make sure. And it was about a month before the opening of the Jewish Museum. This goes back a few years. And I said, Mrs. Mayor, I said, look, I said, I understand that there's elections. I understand that there's a budget issue and I understand this, but these are Jewish tombstones and this is unacceptable. I said, we have a few ways of doing this. We can wait, but what's going to happen is every single Jewish journalist and international journalist who comes to the opening of Polin Museum, I will personally take to the park to show them both sides, to show them how you're helping and opening a wonderful Jewish museum, but also trampling on Jewish heritage and history every day. And miraculously, they found a budget 24 hours later and started the work and taking the tombstones out. So sometimes arms have to be twisted a little bit. I think that's probably a little bit of the Israeli in me coming through. But generally, there's, you know, the Polish government, the way Poles look at this is they kind of, they'll, it's difficult to ascertain as to when cemeteries were destroyed, right? Because a lot of the cemeteries were destroyed during the German Nazi occupation. And in that case, you know, the Germans would break up Jewish cemeteries. For example, in Piotrków-Trybunalski, they'd even force Jews to use the tombstones to make them to pave streets for the German war machines. So in that case, it's not the Poles' fault. In the case of Praga, in Warsaw, 100% it was Poles afterwards. And they tend to react decently to it. I haven't encountered any real pushback over it. It's often tricky with the local Jewish communities because it gives them a huge amount of work. You know, they're suddenly to receive thousands of fragments of broken stones, you know, that they sometimes unfortunately prefer not to have to deal with it. And they have their own requests from local government. So they want to use a request on a stone. So if anything, we see a little bit of pushback sometimes with dealing with this from the local Jewish communities, but by far and large, the people are fine with it. It really is. I mean, that's the big question. And to be honest, I think the answer is easier than most of us realize. I was actually driven mad the last few days watching everybody talking about International Holocaust Memorial Day and getting really bloody angry at the lack of people using the word Jew. It's like, you know, it's driving me nuts. It's like, you know, genocides and the Holocaust. Look, you know, we were picked on because we were Jews. We must be remembered as Jews. It's as simple as that. And even for a younger generation, for my peers as well, I say this to them all the time. I say, look, you know, I said, you're going to be called a Jew, whether you like it or not, right? Whether it's now, in a week, in a month, or in 100 years, you're going to be remembered as a Jew. So act like one and be proud of it. And that, I think that's the first thing that we need to instill is this pride in who we are as Jews. But also when we're dealing with the issue of the Holocaust, I personally have found it much easier to enter discussion and conversations with people with working through the stories of the righteous amongst the nations. And I think that this is probably the approach that we've seen the most success in. And the reason we have this interest that we do when we're dealing, for example, with celebrities and so on and so forth. Because, you know, I can tell you Ray Allen, the NBA All-Star, every time he puts something on about the Holocaust, people like his community go mad. Like a lot listen, but he gets a lot of hate. Why are you dealing with Jewish problems? We have this, and this. Right? So when we approached Ray and said, okay, hold on a second, look, this is Mrs. Schnepp, this is Mrs. Bandel, this is what they did. He puts a picture on hugging them, talking to them, telling their story. It appeals to this social justice part of this want that young people have today, right? And all of us want to be active and want to be good. So, you know, often when dealing with the Holocaust, you know, we've seen many school groups come through Poland, and they'll go from camp to camp to camp, and they walk around with their head down the whole week. It's very important, it's impactful, but it's also too heavy. The older they grow, there's honestly, when I started people like Jonny, there's Holocaust fatigue. People don't want to hear about this anymore. So when we tell the stories of the righteous, it enables them to look at someone who did something good in this history. It's the same with TikTok, right? If I came to people, smash in their face 6 million Jews, you know, murder, gas chamber, people, oh, no one wants to hear that. It's aggressive, you know, my safe space, you know, all of this stuff. When you talk about the righteous, you soften your way into the history, right? So we start talking, you know, my eldest daughter is 11 and my youngest is 7. I've brought them to Poland a few times, and I've introduced them to the righteous on every single trip. Now my daughters met with Mr. Mossberg. They saw, you know, Mr. Mossberg was in Mauthausen, and he wasn't tattooed. They didn't bother tattooing people in Mauthausen. They gave them a kind of a bracelet thing that they had to strap on their arm. And actually, Eddie made this for me. I wear this every single day. This was his number. And my eldest daughter said, "Dad, is that from the camps?" And I said, "Yes." And she was still, even at 11, I didn't go into all the details. But when we met with the righteous, I was able to talk to her about everything. And I was able to say, "Michali, even Yaeli, my 7-year-old, this lady hid Jews in her home during the war. Why? Because bad people were trying to do, and it's just a softer way to deal with this subject. And I really believe that younger people feel this social justice element of it as well. Again, we can't compare Holocaust to other things, but you have the story now with the Uyghur community in China. You know, Australia, I think, was the only country that really stood up to the Chinese over the last year anyway. You guys got a bit of a kicking for it, so you might as well go all in and attack them for the Uyghurs as well. But you can see the British government are flat out really refusing to deal with this subject. Unfortunately, the United States under Biden is probably going to let it all go as well. This is a community who are being mass murdered today. And when our young generation are able to take this message from the Holocaust of our people being killed and turn that into a social justice issue, I think that this is also the way of dealing with it, is potentially approaching them in a softer way.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jonny. Ladies and gentlemen, we're probably getting to the end of the time span that everybody's comfortable allotting. I'm going to give one more opportunity for a last question. Last comment. Gone. So I'm going to end this evening with a huge thank you and a huge vote of gratitude to Jonny. You know, you and from the depths embody and actually epitomize everything that March of the Living stands for, that we believe in, that we teach for, that we educate about. And all I can say is that you're not a graduate of March of the Living, but if our graduates were able to embody a small part of the kinds of things that you and the foundation do, the world would be a better place and Holocaust memorialisation would be in a very different space. So, Yishar Koach. Hopefully you get through this COVID quickly as possible and can get back to your family in Israel. Thank you for getting up so early for us and continue the fantastic work. And we will continue our dialogue and partnership in doing fantastic things in Holocaust education going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining.